Everything we know about history begins with the first recorded civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, ancient kingdoms rising from the dust. But what if they were not the first? What if before the pyramids, before the flood myths, before written language, there was another civilization? A civilization so advanced, so powerful, that its disappearance reshaped the world itself. Ancient legends from different cultures speak of a time before time, a world that ended in fire, flood, or cosmic catastrophe. And what's more unsettling is that these stories sound disturbingly similar across continents, across thousands of years. How could disconnected civilizations describe the same forgotten world? Was there once a global society, erased so completely that only fragments survived in myth? Tonight, we explore the possibility that human history did not begin where we think it did, and that the first civilization may have vanished long before history ever began. The night before the fall was deceptively ordinary. The city glowed with light, its towers shimmering against the horizon, its canals alive with movement. Merchants traded, children laughed, priests prayed, and leaders celebrated their empire's supposed eternity. To the people of Atlantis, nothing seemed out of place. But beneath the surface, the world was already shifting. The ocean carried strange currents, subtle but unnatural. The stars flickered faintly, their constellations bending in ways unnoticed by most. And in the temples, priests whispered of silence pressing against the walls. A silence that felt heavier than prayer. The leaders dismissed these signs. They declared the city eternal, untouchable, destined to outlast time itself. Their voices echoed through plazas, drowning out whispers of unease. The people believed them, or wanted to believe. After all, Atlantis had stood for centuries, its brilliance unmatched, its power unquestioned. Why should tomorrow be any different? Yet, in the shadows, some felt the truth. Fishermen noticed animals fleeing the deep. Astronomers charted stars that no longer aligned. Mothers pulled children indoors, sensing danger in the air. They did not know what was coming, but they felt it. The night before the fall was not marked by chaos. It was marked by denial. The city celebrated, laughed, and sang. Even as the world around it began to unravel, the silence grew heavier, the ocean grew restless, the sky grew strange, and Atlantis, blind in its pride, danced on the edge of destruction. By dawn, the illusion would shatter. The fall would begin, and the civilization that believed itself eternal would vanish before history began. And hey, if you love mythology and history from all cultures, plus those forbidden ancient stories that make you question everything, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how far these legends travel. Atlantis was not just a city. It was a statement, a declaration carved in stone and crystal. Its towers pierced the sky, gleaming with light drawn from mysterious energies. Its canals flowed with precision, engineered to obey human command. Its plazas echoed with music, laughter, and the certainty that nothing could ever threaten its greatness. The people believed they lived at the center of the world. Merchants boasted of wealth beyond imagination. Priests spoke of divine favor, insisting the gods themselves had chosen Atlantis as their eternal home. Leaders proclaimed that the city was untouchable, destined to outlast time itself. Every word, every ritual, every celebration reinforced the same idea: Atlantis was forever. But beneath this confidence lay arrogance. The city's brilliance blinded its people to fragility. They believed their towers could never fall, their canals could never flood, their power could never fade. They dismissed whispers of danger, mocked those who spoke of omens, and silenced voices of caution. To doubt Atlantis was to doubt eternity itself. The streets reflected this pride. Children played beneath towering statues, their laughter echoing against marble walls. Musicians filled the air with songs of triumph, their melodies rising above the hum of the canals. Couples strolled through plazas, whispering promises of futures that stretched endlessly ahead. The city was alive with joy, with certainty, with the illusion that tomorrow would always look like today. Yet, in the shadows, unease lingered. Fishermen noticed strange movements in the ocean. Astronomers charted stars that no longer aligned. Priests whispered of silence, pressing against temples, a silence that felt heavier than prayer. But these warnings were drowned by the roar of celebration. Atlantis did not listen. Atlantis believed. The city that believed it was eternal stood on the edge of destruction, blind to the truth. Its towers gleamed, its canals pulsed, its people laughed, all while the world around them began to shift. Eternity was not theirs to command, but Atlantis, lost in pride, could not see it. By dawn, the illusion would break. The city that believed it was eternal would learn the truth. Nothing lasts forever. The city of Atlantis believed itself eternal, but the heavens had already begun to whisper otherwise. On the night when the first omens appeared, the sky did not behave as it should. At first, the changes were subtle. Stars flickered faintly, their light bending in ways that astronomers struggled to explain. Constellations that had guided sailors for generations seemed to shift, their familiar patterns dissolving into unfamiliar shapes. The moon's glow fractured, casting broken reflections across the restless ocean. The people noticed, but they did not understand. Children pointed at the sky, laughing at the strange colors. Merchants dismissed the flickering stars as tricks of the eye. Musicians sang louder, drowning out whispers of unease. Only the astronomers, perched in their towers, felt the weight of what they saw. Their charts no longer matched the heavens. Their instruments revealed distortions that defied reason. The sky was rewriting itself. Then came the colors. Crimson streaks spread across the horizon, followed by violet swirls, and a sickly green glow that lingered like a wound in the heavens. The people gathered in plazas, staring upward in awe and fear. Some whispered of divine wrath, others of cosmic forces rising from the deep, but all agreed the sky was no longer theirs. Priests declared it a sign, the gods turning their gaze away from Atlantis. Sailors spoke of storms beyond imagination, waves taller than towers, winds that could tear stone apart. Leaders, desperate to maintain control, insisted it was spectacle, not omen. They told the people to remain calm, to trust in Atlantis's eternal strength. But their voices shook, betraying the fear they tried to hide. The signs in the sky were not random. They were deliberate, heavy, undeniable. Every flicker of light, every fracture of the moon, every unnatural color carried the same message. Atlantis's time was ending. The heavens, once steady and eternal, now mirrored the chaos of the earth and sea. The people stood frozen beneath the shifting sky. Some prayed, some fled, some laughed in denial. But none could escape the truth. The heavens had turned against them. By dawn, the signs would no longer be whispers. They would be warnings carved across the sky, impossible to ignore. And Atlantis, blind in its pride, would face the truth it had dismissed. Atlantis had always been alive with sound. The hum of canals, laughter of children, chants of priests, and rhythm of merchants filled its streets. It was a city that never slept, its heartbeat measured in voices, music, and movement. But then the silence came. At first it was subtle, a pause in the wind, a lull in the waves. People dismissed it, but the silence grew heavier, pressing against walls. Canals slowed, currents sluggish. Merchants paused mid-sentence, voices swallowed, musicians faltered, notes hollow. Even animals sensed it, unsettled by the absence of sound. This silence was not peace. It was unnatural, carrying tension. Priests whispered gods turned away. Astronomers noted silent stars. Sailors stared at soundless waves. People tried to ignore it, singing louder, laughing harder. But the silence pressed deeper, suffocating resistance. The city felt suspended, caught between existence and something else. The unnatural silence was a presence, unseen but undeniable. It was the second omen, a warning that eternity was an illusion. Atlantis, blind in its pride, did not understand, but the silence understood. It was waiting. By dawn, the silence would no longer be a whisper. It would be the pause before destruction, the moment the world itself prepared to strike. In the heart of Atlantis, council chambers glowed with firelight. Marble walls reflected torches, casting long shadows. They gathered to confront whispers of silence, strange signs in the sky, and unease spreading through their people. Yet even here, in the seat of power, pride outweighed caution, blinding them to the growing peril. The High Chancellor rose first, his voice steady but strained. He declared, "Atlantis is eternal. The tremors, the silence, the shifting heavens, they are tests, not threats. We will endure, as always." His words echoed through the chamber, but behind them, a palpable fear lingered in the air. Others disagreed. The astronomer general, pale from sleepless nights, laid out charts that no longer matched the heavens. "The stars are moving," he warned. "The constellations are breaking apart. This is not illusion. It is omen." His voice trembled, but his conviction was clear, a stark warning against complacency. The admiral of the fleet slammed his fist against the table. "If danger comes, the ocean will carry us to safety. Our ships are strong, our sailors loyal. Atlantis will not fall." Yet he knew the sea had grown restless. Its currents twisted beyond command, a silent rebellion against their control. The priests whispered among themselves, their chants broken by unease and conflicting beliefs. Some claimed the gods had turned away, abandoning Atlantis to its fate, leaving them vulnerable. Others insisted the silence was divine protection, a shield against unseen forces, a sign of hope. Their voices clashed, rising in contradiction, leaving the chamber divided and uncertain. The final decision came not from wisdom, but from arrogance, a fatal flaw. The council proclaimed calm, ordering celebrations to continue, temples to remain open, markets to thrive. They silenced warnings, dismissed omens, and demanded faith in Atlantis's eternity, ignoring all signs. To admit danger was to admit weakness, and weakness was unthinkable for the proud city. Outside the chamber, the people listened, their reactions divided by hope and fear. Some believed, clinging to the illusion of safety. Others doubted, whispering of escape, of omens, of collapse. The city was split, not by tremors or silence, but by the decisions of its leaders. The final decisions were not choices of survival. They were choices of pride, a fatal flaw. And pride, more than tremors or silence, would seal Atlantis's fate, leading to its demise. By dawn, the leaders' voices would be drowned by the roar of destruction, a cataclysmic end. Their decisions, carved in arrogance, would become the final mistake of a city that believed itself eternal. While the leaders of Atlantis clung to pride and denial, the ocean had already begun to betray them. For centuries, the sea had been their ally. But on that night, the waters shifted in ways no sailor had ever seen. It began with the currents. Fishermen noticed their nets dragged in unnatural directions, defying the moon's rhythm. Waves rose without wind, surging against docks with sudden violence before retreating into eerie calm. The ocean seemed alive, restless, as though something vast stirred beneath its surface. Then came the creatures. Schools of fish fled the deep, swarming toward the shallows in frantic bursts. Dolphins, once playful companions, vanished. Whales surfaced, their haunting cries echoing, warning of something unseen. Even seabirds abandoned their perches, circling wildly before disappearing inland. The ocean was emptying itself. Sailors whispered of shadows moving beneath the waves, shapes too large, too deliberate, too unnatural. Some claimed to see glowing fissures opening on the ocean floor, releasing streams of light that pulsed upward. Others swore the water itself trembled, vibrating with a rhythm that matched the tremors beneath the city. The harbors grew uneasy. Ships rocked violently against their moorings, ropes snapping, wood splintering. Merchants abandoned cargo, staring at the sea with hollow eyes. Children cried as waves flooded streets. The ocean, once a promise of safety, now felt like a predator waiting to strike. Priests declared the sea was angry, demanding sacrifice. Leaders dismissed the warnings, insisting it was merely restless. But the sailors knew better. They recognized its moods. This was not restlessness, this was intention. The strange activity in the ocean was not random. It was deliberate, heavy, undeniable. The sea was preparing, gathering strength, waiting for the moment to unleash its fury. Atlantis, blind in its arrogance, did not understand, but the ocean understood. It was patient, it was inevitable. By dawn, the ocean would no longer whisper, it would roar. Atlantis would face the truth. The sea that had sustained them would become the force that destroyed them. The omens had already appeared. The sky twisted into unnatural colors. The silence pressed against temples, and the ocean stirred with restless violence. Yet, in Atlantis, the warnings were ignored. It was not ignorance, it was arrogance. The leaders had spoken, and their words drowned out the voices of caution. Atlantis is eternal, they declared. No storm, no tremor, no silence can touch us. The people wanted to believe, and so they did. Astronomers begged the council to listen. Their charts no longer matched the heavens. Their instruments revealed distortions that defied reason. The stars are breaking apart, they warned. The constellations are shifting. This is not illusion. It is omen. But their voices were silenced, dismissed as fear-mongering. Fishermen spoke of strange currents, of creatures fleeing the deep, of shadows moving beneath the waves. The ocean is changing, they pleaded. It is not safe. Yet the council laughed. The sea has always been ours, they replied. It will remain so. Priests whispered of silence pressing against temples, a silence that felt heavier than prayer. Some claimed the gods had turned away, abandoning Atlantis to its fate. Others insisted the silence was divine protection, but the council chose the interpretation that suited them: protection, not warning. The people, caught between fear and faith, followed the leaders. They returned to plazas, to markets, to celebrations. Musicians played louder, dancers spun faster, merchants shouted across stalls. They drowned the omens in noise, in denial, in the illusion of eternity. But the warnings did not fade. The sky continued to shift. The silence pressed deeper. The ocean grew restless. The world itself was speaking, but Atlantis refused to listen. Warnings ignored are not warnings erased. They linger, they grow, they wait. And when they are finally understood, it is too late. By dawn, the warnings would no longer be whispers. They would be shouts, undeniable and merciless. And Atlantis, blind in its pride, would face the truth it had dismissed. Atlantis was not only a city of marble and canals, it was a city of power. Its leaders boasted of technologies that harnessed the forces of nature, crystals that glowed with endless energy, and machines that bent the ocean and sky to human will. For centuries, this power had been their shield, their proof of eternity. But when the omens grew undeniable, that power revealed its limits. The temples, filled with shimmering crystals, pulsed with light as priests attempted to summon protection. They chanted, believing divine energy would shield the city. Yet the silence pressed deeper, swallowing their voices. The crystals dimmed, their glow flickering like dying embers. Power that had once illuminated the city now faltered against forces greater than itself. In the harbors, engineers activated machines designed to control the tides. Massive structures groaned as gears turned, attempting to push back the surging waves. For a moment, the ocean seemed to obey, but then, with sudden violence, the currents twisted, snapping the machines apart as though they were toys. The sea was not theirs to command. Astronomers, desperate to understand the shifting heavens, turned to instruments that had guided them for generations. They charted stars, measured distortions, calculated patterns, but the sky refused to yield its secrets. Constellations bent beyond recognition. The moon fractured into broken reflections, and lightning split the heavens without warning. Knowledge, once their greatest weapon, became useless in the face of chaos. The council, clinging to pride, ordered the city's defenses raised. Guards lined the streets, towers bristled with weapons, ships prepared for battle. But what enemy could they fight? The tremors beneath their feet, the silence pressing against their temples, the ocean rising with deliberate fury. None could be defeated with swords or shields. Atlantis's power was built to fight men, not the world itself. The people watched as their leaders invoked strength, as priests summoned light, as engineers activated machines. They saw power unleashed, but they also saw its failure. The tremors continued, the silence deepened, the ocean surged. The city's brilliance, its pride, its supposed eternity, none of it mattered. Power that could not save them was worse than weakness. It gave false hope, false confidence, false belief in eternity. And when it failed, it left only despair. By dawn, Atlantis would understand the truth. No power, no crystal, no machine could save them. The forces they had tried to command were the very forces that would erase them. Despite omens in the sky, silence pressing against temples, and the restless ocean, Atlantis chose to dance. Leaders, desperate to maintain control, declared a grand festival, a celebration of eternity, a defiance against fear. On the eve of destruction, Atlantis lit its streets with fire and music, plazas filled with laughter. Musicians played louder, melodies rising above the unease. Dancers spun in brilliant costumes, their movements reflecting torchlight against marble walls. Merchants offered abundance as proof that nothing could threaten the city. Children ran through crowds, their voices echoing against towers that trembled faintly. The celebration was not joy, was denial. Every song, every dance, an attempt to drown the truth. People knew the omens. They had seen the sky fracture, felt the silence, watched the ocean surge, but they chose to believe leaders, to cling to the illusion of eternity. If Atlantis was eternal, then tonight was proof. Priests marched through streets, chanting blessings, declaring divine favor. The council paraded through plazas, proclaiming strength. Their voices carried confidence, but their eyes betrayed fear. Above, heavens burned with unnatural colors. Crimson streaks spread across the horizon. Violet swirls twisted into spirals, and lightning split the sky without storm. People stared upward, then laughed nervously, insisting it was spectacle, not omen. "The gods are celebrating with us," they said. "The sky itself joins our festival." But beneath the music, the silence lingered. It pressed against walls, seeped into canals, and hung over the city like a shadow. The ocean surged against harbors, flooding streets. Tremors pulsed beneath the ground, shaking towers that stood tall only by illusion. The celebration continued, but the world was already unraveling. The final celebration was not triumph, it was tragedy. It was the last heartbeat of a city that believed itself eternal, the final denial before collapse. Atlantis danced on the edge of destruction, blind to the truth, clinging to pride. By dawn, the music would fade, the laughter would vanish, and the city that celebrated eternity would face the silence of its end. The final celebration had ended, but echoes of music and laughter lingered faintly in the streets of Atlantis. As dawn approached, the people turned their eyes toward the horizon. What they saw silenced even the most defiant voices. At first, it was only a shadow, a faint darkness stretching across the edge of the sea, swallowing the rising sun. Sailors noticed it first, pointing from the harbors with trembling hands. "The horizon is wrong," they whispered. "It moves." The shadow grew. It was not cloud, not storm, not smoke. It was heavier, thicker, deliberate. The ocean beneath it churned violently, waves rising in unnatural rhythm. The air carried a strange chill, a warning. Merchants abandoned their stalls, staring at the dark line. Children clung to parents, asking questions no one could answer. Priests fell to their knees, chanting prayers that dissolved into silence. Leaders stood frozen, their voices trapped. The horizon darkened, not with storm, but with inevitability, a wall of shadow, vast and unrelenting. The people watched in awe and terror, realizing the omens had not been illusions, all had been warnings. The darkness carried weight. It pressed against the city, seeping into canals, lingering in plazas, bending the air itself. The people felt it in their bones, a heaviness that made breathing difficult, a presence that could not be denied. Atlantis had celebrated eternity. Now, eternity was ending. The city was not eternal, not immune. It was fragile, and the shadow was here to prove it. By dawn, the horizon would be upon them. and Atlantis, blind in its pride, would face the darkness it had ignored. The horizon had darkened, swallowing the rising sun in a wall of shadow. The people of Atlantis stood frozen, staring at the advancing gloom, and then, without warning, the earth itself began to move. It started as a low vibration, subtle enough that some mistook it for drums, but the sound grew deeper, heavier, until it was no longer sound at all. It was force. The ground trembled beneath feet. Towers groaned against their foundations, and canals rippled violently as if the city itself had taken a breath. Streets cracked. Marble that had stood for centuries split into jagged lines, cutting through plazas and markets. Merchants stumbled as stalls collapsed, their treasures spilling into the fractures. Children screamed as the ground shifted beneath them, pulling toys into widening gaps. The city's heartbeat was no longer music, it was rupture. The tremors spread outward, rolling through temples and harbors. Statues toppled, their stone faces shattering against the earth. Bridges swayed, their arches bending dangerously, before snapping into the canals below. Ships rocked violently against docks, ropes snapping, wood splintering. The ocean surged in response, waves rising higher, feeding the chaos. The people panicked. Some fled through streets that no longer held steady ground. Others clung to walls, praying for stability that never came. Priests shouted chants, their voices drowned by the roar of shifting earth. Leaders shouted orders, but their words were swallowed by collapse. The city was no longer listening. The first shift was not destruction, it was warning. The tremors did not yet consume Atlantis, but they revealed its fragility. Towers that had seemed eternal cracked. Canals that had obeyed command overflowed. Streets that had carried generations split apart. The illusion of eternity shattered with every fracture. The people realized, in that moment, that Atlantis was not untouchable. The earth beneath them had turned against them. The first shift was the beginning, the undeniable strike that proved the omens were real. By dawn, the tremors would grow stronger. The earth would no longer whisper, it would roar. And Atlantis, blind in its pride, would face the collapse it had ignored. The first shift had torn through Atlantis, cracking streets, toppling statues, and shaking towers that had once seemed eternal. The people stood at a crossroads, caught between the instinct to flee and the desperate need to believe, panic or denial. That was the choice. In the markets, chaos erupted. Merchants abandoned their stalls, treasures spilling into fractured streets. Families rushed through plazas, clutching children, searching for safety that no longer existed. Screams echoed against marble walls, blending with the roar of tremors. Panic spread like fire, consuming those who could no longer pretend. But denial was just as powerful. In temples, priests raised their voices, insisting the gods were testing Atlantis, not destroying it. They chanted louder, drowning out the cries of fear. The city is eternal, they proclaimed. The silence is protection. The tremors are trial. Their followers clung to these words, desperate for hope, refusing to see collapse. Leaders fueled the denial. Standing on balconies, they shouted orders, demanding calm. Return to your homes, they commanded. Atlantis will endure. Their voices carried confidence, but their eyes betrayed terror. Some citizens obeyed, retreating indoors, convincing themselves the tremors would pass. Others saw through the illusion, realizing the leaders were as afraid as they were. The streets became divided. On one side, panic, people fleeing, screaming, abandoning possessions, desperate to escape. On the other, denial, people praying, chanting, clinging to illusions, refusing to move. The city was split, not by tremors, but by belief. The ocean surged against harbors, flooding streets near the canals. Ships rocked violently, ropes snapping, wood splintering. Sailors shouted warnings, urging evacuation. But many refused, insisting the sea had always been Atlantis's ally. Panic drove some to board ships. Denial kept others on land. The tremors grew stronger. Towers groaned, bridges swayed, canals overflowed. Panic intensified, denial deepened. The city was no longer united. It was fractured, caught between fear and pride, between truth and illusion. Panic or denial, neither could save them. Panic led to chaos, denial led to blindness. And as the earth continued to move, both paths led to the same end. By dawn, panic would consume the streets, denial would crumble, and Atlantis would face the collapse it had refused to see. The horizon had darkened, swallowing the rising sun in a wall of shadow. The people of Atlantis stood frozen, staring at the advancing gloom, and then the earth itself betrayed them. It began with a rumble, low, distant, almost imperceptible. Some mistook it for thunder rolling across the sea, but the sound grew heavier, deeper, until it was no longer sound at all. It was movement. The ground beneath Atlantis shifted, carrying with it the weight of centuries. Streets cracked open, marble splitting into jagged lines that tore through plazas and markets. Towers groaned against their foundations, their stones grinding as if the city itself resisted collapse. Bridges swayed violently, their arches bending before snapping into the canals below. The tremors spread outward, rolling through temples, harbors, and homes, leaving nothing untouched. The people screamed. Merchants abandoned treasures, families clutched children, priests shouted prayers that dissolved into chaos. Sailors rushed to the harbors, only to find ships rocking violently against docks, ropes snapping, wood splintering. The ocean surged in response, waves rising higher, feeding the destruction. The tremors did not relent. They grew stronger, pulsing through the earth with relentless rhythm. Statues toppled, their stone faces shattering against fractured streets. Temples cracked, their walls splitting, their crystals dimming. The city that had believed itself eternal was breaking apart beneath its own weight. Leaders shouted orders, demanding calm, but their voices were drowned by the roar of collapse. Guards lined the streets, but what enemy could they fight? The tremors were not men, not armies, not storms. They were the earth itself, turning against Atlantis. The people realized, in that moment, that eternity was gone. The ground beneath them had betrayed them. The tremors were not warning, they were destruction. The earth was no longer whispering, it was roaring. When the earth began to move, Atlantis's illusion shattered. The city was fragile, vulnerable, mortal. Its towers, its canals, its temples, none could withstand the force of inevitability. By dawn, the tremors would consume the city. The earth would no longer shift gently. It would break relentlessly, mercilessly, and Atlantis, blind in its pride, would face the collapse it had ignored. As the earth roared beneath Atlantis, the heavens themselves began to betray the city. What had once been a canopy of stars transformed into a theater of chaos. The sky no longer offered light or comfort. At first, the changes were subtle. The moon fractured into broken reflections, its glow splintering across the restless ocean. Constellations dissolved, their familiar shapes bending into jagged patterns that no astronomer could chart. But then the heavens erupted. Crimson streaks tore across the horizon, bleeding into violet spirals that twisted unnaturally. Lightning split the sky without storm, jagged bolts striking towers and temples with merciless precision. Thunder rolled not in waves but in violent bursts, shaking the air as though the heavens themselves were cracking apart. The people stared upward, frozen in awe and terror. Children clung to parents, asking why the stars had abandoned them. Priests fell to their knees, chanting prayers that dissolved into silence. Sailors whispered of cosmic forces rising from the deep. Leaders, desperate to maintain control, insisted it was spectacle, not omen. But their voices shook, betraying fear. The sky was no longer distant. It pressed against the city, heavy and deliberate. The colors carried weight, seeping into plazas, lingering in canals, bending the air itself. The heavens mirrored the chaos of the earth and sea, amplifying destruction. The people realized, in that moment, that the world was no longer theirs. The earth had shifted, the ocean had surged, and now the sky itself had turned against them. Eternity was gone. The city was surrounded by the very forces of existence. The sky changes were not random. They were deliberate, heavy, undeniable. Every streak of color, every fracture of the moon, every bolt of lightning carried the same message. Atlantis's time was ending. By dawn, the heavens would no longer whisper. They would roar, merciless and unrelenting. And Atlantis, blind in its pride, would face the truth it had dismissed. The tremors had shattered streets, the ocean had surged against harbors, and the sky had twisted into chaos. Atlantis was no longer a city of pride and celebration. It was a city standing at the edge of collapse. And in that moment, the people realized there was no turning back. The leaders still clung to denial, shouting orders from balconies, insisting the city would endure. But their voices were drowned by the roar of destruction. The ground split beneath them, towers cracked, canals overflowed. Their words no longer carried weight. Pride had lost its power. Families fled through fractured streets, clutching children, abandoning possessions. Merchants left treasures behind, their wealth meaningless against the tremors. Sailors rushed to ships, desperate to escape, but the ocean was no longer theirs. Waves rose higher, snapping docks, swallowing vessels before they could depart. Priests chanted prayers, raising crystals that flickered faintly. But the silence pressed deeper, swallowing their voices, dimming their light. The gods, if they had ever been present, were gone. Atlantis stood alone. The point of no return was not marked by a single event. It was marked by realization. The people saw the fractures in marble, the collapse of temples, the surge of the ocean, the chaos of the sky. They understood, finally, that eternity was an illusion. Atlantis was mortal. Atlantis was ending. Panic consumed the streets. Denial crumbled. The city was no longer divided. It was united in fear. But fear could not save them. The tremors grew stronger. The ocean surged higher. The sky burned brighter. The forces of the world had turned against Atlantis, and there was no path back to safety. The point of no return had arrived. The city that believed itself eternal had crossed the threshold into destruction. There was no escape, no salvation, no second chance. By dawn, Atlantis would no longer stand. The point of no return was not the end. Atlantis trembled, its towers cracked, canals overflowing. People were torn between panic and denial. The earth shifted, the ocean surged, the sky burned. Yet, in the heartbeat before destruction, there was stillness. The silence returned, heavier than ever, pressing against walls, seeping into streets like a final warning. The people froze, caught in the pause between chaos and collapse. Merchants clutched treasures that no longer mattered. Families held children close, their eyes wide with fear. Priests raised crystals that flickered faintly. Their chants were swallowed by the weight of silence. The leaders stood powerless, their voices gone, pride shattered. They had promised eternity, but eternity had vanished. Now they faced the truth. Atlantis was mortal. The ocean stilled, its waves rising but not yet falling. The sky glowed with fractured light. Crimson and violet streaks froze above the horizon. The earth held its breath, tremors pausing. It was the moment before impact, separating illusion from reality, denial from truth, life from destruction. The people felt it in their bones, a heaviness that made breathing difficult, a presence that could not be ignored. Atlantis stood suspended, caught in silence, waiting for the inevitable. The city that believed itself eternal was about to learn the truth. By dawn, the pause would end, the impact would come. Atlantis, blind in its pride, would face the fury it had ignored. The collapse had begun, yet for a fleeting moment, Atlantis was wrapped in silence. Not peace, but the silence of inevitability. The tremors that tore through streets and toppled statues paused. The ocean, restless and violent, stilled as though holding its breath. The sky fractured into crimson and violet spirals, froze in unnatural stillness. Everything seemed suspended, caught in a pause heavier than sound. Streets lay cracked and empty. Canals overflowed, but no longer surged. Towers leaned precariously, yet did not fall. The city itself was waiting, bracing for the strike that had not yet come. Silence pressed against walls, seeped into plazas. The people felt it. Families huddled together, clutching children with trembling hands. Merchants abandoned treasures, their wealth meaningless. Priests clutched dimming crystals, their chants swallowed by the silence. No one spoke, no one dared move. The silence was not absence, it was presence, a force that lingered, unseen but undeniable. Leaders stood powerless, their voices gone, their pride shattered. They had promised eternity, but eternity had vanished. Now they faced the truth in silence. Atlantis was mortal. The council stood frozen, staring at the city they could no longer save. The silence was not mercy. It was the pause before destruction, the moment the world itself prepared to strike. The people understood, finally, that this was not a reprieve. It was the final warning. Across Atlantis, the silence carried the same message. The end was here. The city believed itself eternal. It was suspended in a moment that felt endless, but it was only the calm before the storm. By dawn, the silence would break. The ocean would roar. The earth would shatter. The sky would burn. And Atlantis, blind in its pride, would vanish into the silence it could not escape. The silence had stretched across Atlantis, heavy and suffocating, pressing against every wall and every breath. But silence is never eternal. It broke, not with whispers, but with fury. The collapse had begun. The first strike came from the towers, marble structures that had stood for centuries, gleaming with pride, cracked and crumbled. Their foundations, weakened by tremors, gave way. Monuments toppled into the streets, Statues of kings and gods shattered, their faces breaking against fractured stones. The symbols of eternity were erased in moments. The canals, once the lifeblood of the city, turned against it. Water surged violently, overflowing into plazas and markets. Bridges snapped, their arches collapsing into the flood. Homes along the canals were swallowed, their walls torn apart by currents that no longer obeyed command. The ocean, once Atlantis's ally, had breached its defenses. Temples split apart, their walls collapsing as crystals dimmed and shattered. Priests screamed prayers, but their voices were drowned by the roar of destruction. The gods were silent. The silence pressed heavier than ever, suffocating chants, swallowing hope. The people panicked. Families fled through fractured streets, clutching children, abandoning possessions. Merchants left treasures behind, their wealth meaningless against the tremors. Sailors rushed to ships, desperate to escape. But the ocean rose higher, snapping docks, swallowing vessels before they could depart. Leaders shouted orders, demanding calm, but their voices were lost in the chaos. Guards lined streets, but their weapons were useless against tremors, floods, and fire. The council, once so confident, stood powerless, watching the city they had sworn eternal crumble before their eyes. The collapse was relentless. Every tremor, every surge, every bolt of lightning tore Atlantis apart, piece by piece. The city that had believed itself eternal was breaking, not in silence, but in fury. The people realized, finally, that there was no salvation. No crystal, no machine, no prayer could stop the forces that had turned against them. The collapse was not trial, it was judgment. By dawn, Atlantis would no longer stand. The collapse had begun, and nothing could stop it. Eternity was gone. Pride was gone. Atlantis was ending. When the fury of the earth, sea, and sky finally struck Atlantis, most were consumed in the chaos. Towers collapsed, canals overflowed, temples shattered, and the ocean rose to claim the city. Yet legends whisper that a few survived, scattered souls who escaped the destruction, carrying memories of what they had seen. They would have seen the towers fall, monuments of pride reduced to rubble in moments. Streets once filled with laughter and trade split open, swallowing homes and markets. The canals, once shimmering veins of the city, became torrents of destruction, sweeping away everything in their path. Survivors would remember the sound of stone grinding, water roaring, and the sky itself cracking apart. They would have seen the ocean rise, waves towering above harbors, swallowing ships before they could flee. The sea, once Atlantis's ally, became its executioner. Survivors on higher ground watched as the ocean poured into the city, flooding plazas, temples, and palaces, until Atlantis was no longer visible beneath the waves. They would have seen the sky burn. Crimson streaks tore across the heavens. Lightning split towers, and thunder rolled without storm. The moon fractured into broken reflections. Survivors would remember the heavens not as distant guardians, but as forces of chaos, complicit in the destruction. They would have seen the people, families, clinging to one another, priests raising crystals that flickered faintly, leaders shouting orders that no one could hear. Panic consumed the streets, denial crumbled, and fear united the city. Survivors would remember faces twisted in terror, voices drowned by collapse, and the silence that followed. And finally, they would have seen the end. Atlantis, once proud and eternal, vanished beneath the ocean. Towers, temples, markets, and homes disappeared into the waves. The city that had believed itself immortal was gone. Survivors, scattered across distant shores, carried only fragments of memory, visions of collapse, echoes of silence, and the weight of loss. What survivors may have seen was not just destruction. It was the unraveling of pride, the breaking of illusion, the truth that no city, no power, no eternity can stand against the forces of the world. Atlantis was gone, but its story endured, carried in whispers, in legends, in warnings. By dawn, the survivors would awaken not in Atlantis, but in exile. And the world, forever changed, would remember what they had seen: the fall of a city that believed itself eternal. Atlantis fell in a single night, a night of tremors, surging seas, fractured skies, and silence heavier than stone. The city that believed itself eternal vanished beneath the ocean, leaving behind only fragments of memory and whispers of legend. Yet the story of that night endures, revealing pride, denial, and forces greater than any civilization. That night matters because it shows the fragility of power. Atlantis had harnessed crystals, machines, and knowledge, believing it could command the earth, sea, and sky. But when those forces turned against them, no invention, no prayer, no weapon could save them. The collapse was not just physical, it was the breaking of illusion. That night matters because it shows the danger of arrogance. The omens were clear: silence pressing against temples, the ocean restless, the sky fractured. Leaders dismissed them, priests reinterpreted, people drowned warnings in celebration. Warnings ignored are not warnings erased. Atlantis chose denial, and denial became destruction. That night matters because it shows the inevitability of change. No city, no empire, no power is eternal. The forces of the world, earth, sea, sky, silence, move beyond human command. Atlantis believed itself untouchable, but the world reminded them that eternity belongs to nothing and no one. And that night matters because it became legend. Survivors carried fragments of memory to distant lands. They spoke of towers that fell, oceans that rose, skies that burned, and silence that consumed. Their stories spread, reshaped by time, transformed into myth. Atlantis became more than a city. It became a warning, a symbol, a reminder. Why does that night still matter? Because it is not only the story of Atlantis, it is the story of every civilization that believes itself eternal. Every leader who ignores warnings, every people who cling to pride. It is a mirror held to humanity, reflecting the truth that no power, no wealth, no glory can stand against the forces of the world. Atlantis fell, but its story endures. And as long as it is told, that night will matter, not as history alone, but as a warning carried across generations. The silence that consumed Atlantis was not the end of sound. It was the beginning of memory. And memory, unlike marble or crystal, cannot be drowned. Atlantis is gone, but the night it fell still speaks.